Hey guys, I wanted to talk a little bit about some file I/O stuff and a little bit more about kind of manipulating strings and all that, and kind of how it relates to the current assignment. So a couple of things. First of all, on our site, right, you may or may not have seen that I have a link to the Java docs, okay? Hopefully you've seen Java docs before, okay? So the Java docs basically is this site here that actually documents every single thing that is built into Java, right? So it's broken down into the various classes, right? So java.util, for instance, font package, Java I/O package, of course Java lang. You should all know is interesting because anything that's in here we can just refer to directly. And so there's things in here, for instance, like the string class, right? So if we want to talk about strings, what's special about Java lang is that anything in Java lang we can just use that particular class's name. So we'll say, for instance, string whatever, or we say system.out.println. Stuff that's in other packages, that's where we have to deal with the import and out, the import stuff. Okay, but we don't have to deal with that here. All right, so we saw before, I have another little project here. I have the same data files open and all that. And I just kind of wanted to show you kind of how to begin starting to think about some of this stuff. So I'll create a scanner, I'll call it in, and just like we saw in the last video, right, I'll do the usual getting this all set up. I'll hit Alt-Enter. Yes, we want the scanner from Java.util. Okay, now to create a scanner, well, let's go take a look. Okay, so, that's not the one that I want. Anyways, so over here, I already went to look up Scanner, right? Scanner is in the Java util package, right? And here's the Scanner class. Okay, now here's the cool thing: a lot of the classes have stuff that shows you kind of how to use it. So, for instance, here's an example of how to use the Scanner class to read in this case, a whole number that is typed into by the user from the command line, right? So they could do system in, and then they're doing next int, and so on, right? Here is an example of them using Scanner for reading from a file, right? So new file, just like we saw before, right? So kind of let's put some of this stuff together. Okay, so I could, for instance, I could create something called std in, that's my scanner, and I could wrap that around system in. Right? Now, why do I do that? Well, that gives me the ability to ask the user to type in, for instance, the file name, right? So I could say system out print enter file name, right? And then I can do string file name equals stdin dot next line, right? Or I could technically do next, because that also returns a string, and that way if there happens to be a space, if there happens to be a space in there, now it's going to throw it out. So you kind of got to decide your intent and what exactly you want to do. I guess I'll just leave it as next line, right? So I can do something like that, and then I can have create another scanner. This time I'll just call it in, and then we'll say scanner new file of whatever the file name we got. Okay, and again, just going to come over here and do my Alt-Enter to import the Java I/O, and we see that, notice, this may in fact throw an exception, right? It's entirely possible that the user mistypes the file name, or actually it could, the disk could crash while we're trying to read, etc. Right? So since I don't expect you to have full command of exceptions, and really this assignment isn't about that, I'm just going to do Alt-Enter, and I'm going to just say, yeah, add the exception to the method signature. Okay, so we make it really, really easy. That way, if it fails, the program just dies a horrible death. We're okay with that right now. Okay, otherwise, what I'll do is I'll just say something like, let's print out the first line, right? So we'll say println in next line. Just like that. Okay, so let's take a look at this program running. Right, so enter file name. Right, now remember, so if I do something like sample1.txt, it dies a horrible death. Why? Because like we saw in the previous video, right, the actual path in terms of where it's going to look, it has to look in the data folder, right? So what I have to type is data slash sample1.txt, right? And now, notice it prints out some number, right? What number? Oh, it prints out actually the first line of that file, right? Let's try it out again. Let's try it this time with library books. Okay, so I can say data slash library books.txt, and there's some line, and again I can take a look and see that, oh yeah, that actually is the first line of that file. Okay, so far so good, right? Now, part of the point behind this, not only to kind of get you up to speed on Scanner if you haven't seen it before and all that, but part of yep, that's fine. Let's see. Sure. Okay, so, part of the point behind all this is that this is how you should be doing your development. Excuse me. That is, notice, I figured out, I'm like, okay, well, what is the first kind of thing that I need to do? I need to be able to ask the user for the name of the file. I need to be able to at least start reading information from the file, okay? So I can do those things here. All right, now that we can do that, let's see if we can just read, say, all the lines of a small file. And that's what this sample1 and sample2 are, right? So they're both, fairly small files. Notice sample2 only has 12 lines, sample1 has a total of 10 lines, right? Versus, for instance, Sunspots has over 3,000 lines, and these other ones I think have even more than that. So, we probably, testing with those becomes a little more difficult. But sample 1 and sample 2, nice and easy. Okay, so, how do we actually loop through to be able to read all of the individual lines, right? Well, I mean, I sort of gave it away there. It is a loop, right? And, so there's a bunch of different ways we can do this. As you should have seen in your previous programming class, right? You talked about different kinds of loops. You talked about counting loops. You talked about indefinite loops versus definite loops, right? This is an example of an indefinite loop. That is, we don't know up front exactly how many elements we have, right? So we're probably talking about a while or a do-while loop, okay? Those are our two options in Java. Let me go back to Scanner, and, we can kind of take a look. Okay, there's a bunch of these, right? Here's what I want you to take a look at, though. This has next long, right? So if we scroll down through all this gobbledygook here and everything, get past all the different ways, all the different constructors for the Scanner class, right, we'll see, for instance, we start off with a bunch of has next, big decimal, big integer, has, and what you'll actually find, there's has next line, right? They all return Boolean, return true if there is another one of whatever this thing is in the input. And then we have the next integer, next line, etc. That all basically read those things. Okay, so really the proper way of doing this is to do something like this. I would say, okay, while it's the case that we have a next line, right? And I'm going to use line here versus has next. Again, if you take a look at the signatures, right? So for instance, here's next line, right? Advances the scanner past the current line, returns the input that was skipped. Okay, so basically reads the current line, kind of moves it along and so forth, right? Notice, next line returns a string. There's also a function, a method called next. Right? It says finds and returns the next complete token from this scanner. Well, that's really opaque. So let's take a look at some of these, okay? So for instance, suppose I change that to next and this one to next. Okay, let's take a look at what this gives us. Okay, so if I go ahead and run this and I say data slash sample1.txt, okay, it gives me, looks like all of the individual lines, right? So what's the big deal there? Well, let's take a look. So here's what I'm going to do. Just to kind of make this a little clearer, I'm going to write a for loop here where what I'm basically going to do is I'm just going to say I'm going to read the first 10 lines of the file. Okay, so what we'll do is I'm just going to grab this stuff here and I move it up into there, and then I'll just change this to an if. Well, actually, I'll do a couple of things. right? So I'll say, okay, if it's not the case that there's a next, we'll break, and otherwise we'll do that. Okay, so basically, if there is no next, then what we do is we just break out of this whole loop here. Otherwise, we'll actually read the next thing and print it. Okay, and the reason I'm going to do this is because, you know, to really show you the difference between next and next line, I need a file that's more like something like sunspots or one of those. Okay, and you know, I don't want to have to deal with the input of all over 3,000 lines. So this way, hopefully, we can see the difference with just the first 10. All right, so data/sunspots.text, text, there we go. And notice what happened, right? So next does return strings, right? The first thing it returned was that, then it returns sunspot, then it returns data, then it returns collected, right? Let's take a look, right? So that's the first thing, then we get sunspot, then we get data, then we get collected. Right? So the way next works, it talks about this idea of tokens, right? The whole thing is that these spaces separate the individual tokens. Okay. On the other hand, if I change this to next line, and we say data/sunspots.text, right? Notice, now we're actually reading each line by line. Which do you use? Well, it really depends on what it is that you're trying to do. In our particular case, we actually care about, we want to really process this line by line. So next line and has next line are what we want. But again, I mean, it depends on what exactly it is that you're trying to do. Okay, so that hopefully gives you an idea, at least, of dealing with Scanner. Okay, so let's now talk about probably the harder part of this, right? What I would consider the trickiest part of this is these things here. Okay, so sample 1 and sample 2, they don't have really much in the way of difficult stuff, apart from, well, sample 2 introduces a 0 line, it introduces an empty line, and yeah, those you need to kind of figure out and deal with. But the place where it gets really interesting are things like library books, where the first few lines are comments, live journal, the first several lines are comments, and then sunspots is really the worst of all of them, because not only do we have comments on the first couple of lines, but every single line has a comment on it that needs to be filtered out as well. Okay, so how do you deal with this? There's a whole bunch of ways of doing this. Okay, so like everything in programming, you can deal with this stuff in a lot of different ways, right? Again, if you're not sure about how to deal with this, what you really need to be doing is kind of looking at the documentation, okay? So let me kind of break this stuff up a little bit, right? So remember, before, when we were looking at the documentation for Scanner, right, we saw that next and next line, right? So if I scroll down to next line, wherever it is, here it is, they return a string, okay? So, you know, again, let me just kind of be pedantic about the whole thing. And I'll do this, right? So I'll say string line equals that. Okay. So I've basically just instead of having this nested call inside there, I'm really being explicit about the fact that I'm dealing with a string. Okay, and so that's going to remind me that, oh, okay, any type of filtering and so forth that I might want to do, string is probably the class that I want to look at in terms of options, or at least start to look at, right? So if I go over to the documentation for the string class, okay, let's see. So it says, yeah, the class represents character strings, blah, blah, blah. One thing, this is kind of interesting, right? Notice strings are constant. Their values cannot be changed after they are created. Okay, so that's kind of interesting, right? So basically, once you've created a string, you can't change that individual string. You can do things like pull out parts. In fact, actually here they start to show, right? So for instance, there is the substring method that when it's called on a string, what it actually does, it doesn't modify the string that it's called on. Instead, it creates a brand new string that's the result of that, right? So for instance, here, notice we're basically starting off at different places and so forth. Okay, so that's one part, right? So let's take a look at what string gives us right here. Again, a bunch of the different ways of creating the strings, but we're not creating the strings. We're getting them from the file, so we don't have to worry about that. Let's see what options there are. Okay, so given an index, we can get a character at a particular thing. Now that's going to come in handy later on when you have to check, for instance, is the first character a 0 or a 1 and so forth. But we're not there yet because we need to kind of get rid of the comments and so forth. Okay, let's see. Concat adds in, it basically adds strings together. Contains checks to see if one string is inside another. Content equals, copy of, ends with. Yeah, see, none of these are really are helping us. Formatting. Okay, again, getting the bytes. Hash code. Oh, index of. Now this is interesting. Returns the index within this string of the first occurrence of the specified character, right? Now they're saying character, they actually specify it as ints. Don't think about it too hard. It really is a character, and you can specify that. You can also say, you can also look for a particular character starting from a from index, but even more helpful actually is going to be this one here, index of that takes another string. Okay, so notice it tells us, returns the index within this string of the first occurrence of the specified substring. Okay, now that's a whole lot of gobbledygook. Let's see, right? So returns all that. If the value doesn't exist, it returns -1. That's going to be good to know. So let's take a look here, right? Again, I'm going to come back to our problem. So really our question is, does our string, does the line contain this, and that is an open paren followed by a star, and then a star followed by a closing paren? If it does, we know that that line has a comment. Okay, so that's simple. In fact, what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to do is actually I'm going to code that up as a separate method, just to kind of make my code a little cleaner. And since I'm going to call it directly from main, I'm going to make it static. So I'll say, okay, it's going to return true or false, and basically I'll say has comment, and it's going to take some string, I'll call it S, like so. Okay, so all this function has to do is return true or false if the given string has a comment. Okay, so what I'll say is s dot index of that is not equal to -1. Right, now what is that about? Well, right, and I'm going to do this whole thing kind of as a return. Okay, so basically what I'm saying here is if the index of that stuff is not -1. Where'd I get -1? Well, again, come back to here, right? Basically a -1 means it doesn't exist in there. Okay, so that's how we kind of do that. So we want that to be the case, and we want it to be the case that the string also contains that character, right? So if basically the string contains this sequence and it contains that sequence, then we're going to say that yes, in fact, it does have a comment. Now, technically speaking, this doesn't fully capture the idea, because this would in fact this method would actually return true for a string like this. Right, that string, right? We would find that doesn't return -1, and the index of that is not -1. Okay, but we're not really going to worry about that. I'm not going to expect you to kind of build this up beyond that and so forth, right? If it has both of these, you know what, you're fine. Okay, so now we can now we'll be able to sort of determine if a particular line has a comment or not, right? And again, all I'm going to do here is I'm going to use my little tester stuff here that reads the first 10 lines to check to see if stuff is working, right? So I'm going to do this. I'm going to add into this, and I'm going to say comma has comment plus has comment of line. Okay. So in other words, what I'm going to do is for each one of the first 10 lines, I'll print the line itself, then I'll print out a comma, space, has comment, and then a true or false based on whether that line has a comment. Okay. So let's take a look. So I'll enter in my file name, again, data sunspots.txt. Okay, and let's see, right? So that line has a comment, that line has a comment. Oh yeah, this line, which was basically empty, doesn't have a comment, and the rest do have comments. Okay, so that's pretty cool, right? Notice, we're able to very quickly figure out whether comments exist on a particular line. Okay. One other kind of pro tip, right? So notice we already wrote this code for kind of figuring out for figuring out or for being able to input what the name of the file is. But as we keep doing testing for this, it kind of gets to be a pain because every time I'm going to have to type in something like sunspots.txt to do that. Okay. So what you do, here's the pro tip. I'm going to copy this, paste that. Right, I'm just going to comment out that one, and then I'm just going to, for right now, hard code in the particular file that I'm working with that's allowing me to test my stuff out. Right, so that way, I don't have to worry about every single time I run this to test it that, oh yeah, I got to re-enter the file name, right? And then before you submit it, obviously you'll make the appropriate change. Okay, so cool. We're able to actually figure out which lines have comments. Okay, so let's build on this. Okay, so if has comment line, do something to remove the comment, and then we can print the line. Okay, so how do we deal with this? What do we do, etc.? Well, again, now let's take another look. Okay, so remember, index of tells us basically where in the string that particular thing exists. Okay, so again, for instance, what I want to show you is a couple of things. Okay, one is again, if you take a look at the files. It turns out that you really have only two cases for comments. One where the entire line is a comment, right? Like so. The other, sunspots, is where the stuff before the number is a comment. Okay, you see that? What we don't have is we don't have the case of where we might have, we don't have a case like this. Oops, sorry. Okay. And that's good because that means it's kind of easier. We don't have to try to figure out, oh, okay, is the comment coming before the number? Is the comment coming after the number, etc. Right? Either it's the case that we have just nothing but a comment line itself, or we might have the case where a comment comes before some other stuff. Okay, so that's kind of the first simplifying assumption that we're making here. Just given the sample data stuff that we got, that's all we have to deal with. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's see. Notice there's a replace. That's kind of interesting. It sounds like something would be helpful, right? Replacing one character with another character. But the problem is, notice it's old character. And again, going back, it's not just a matter of replacing, say, those two characters and those two characters. Well, actually, three characters, I guess, right? But we have to really get rid of all of that. Okay, and notice the stuff inside the comments could be any kinds of things, including even other numbers. So replace probably isn't going to be that great for us. Replace all where it says string regex. Now, that's actually interesting. Notice it talks about replace each substring of this string that matches the given regular expression. Okay. Now, regular expressions, basically most modern programming languages will support regular expressions, either built into them, like Java does, or by having one or more libraries that allow them. Okay. Now, regular expressions are really, really cool. They're really powerful, but they are kind of their own separate language. And there's actually a saying, which is there comes a time as a programmer where you have a problem that you decide you're going to solve with regular expressions. Now you have two problems. Okay. They can be a little bit wonky and a little bit funky to deal with. I'll probably actually talk a little bit about them, but right now let's just see what we can do with some good old-fashioned hard work. Right? Last index of. Now that's kind of interesting, right? Returns the index within this string of the last occurrence of the right? So this is sort of the last occurrence as opposed to index of, which gives us the first occurrence. Let's see, region matches. Yeah, again, we have replace. We have splits that deal with regexes. Again, since we're not getting there. Subsequence and substring. Now this is where I wanted to talk about, right? So notice, substring returns a string that is a substring of this string. The substring begins with the character at the specified index and extends to the end of this string, right? So unhappy substring 2 returns happy. Okay. Now, if you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, that seems weird because, n isn't n the second character, so why does substring 2 not return n happy, but it returns happy? Remember, we start counting at 0, right? So u is at index 0, n is at index 1, and so the h is at index 2 there. Okay? All right. So, let's take a look. How can we actually use this, right? Well, remember, index of is returning the place in the string where this other thing exists. And so all we need to do is now look just past that, getting the stuff after it. Okay? In other words, I could do this. Int end comment, I'll call it end comment index. Califragilisticexpialidocious. So end comment index is going to be the line dot index of that. Okay. So that's what it's going to that's what it's going to give me. Then what I'll do is I'll just say line is equal to line substring end comment index. Okay. So if a comment exists, then we look for the end comment, and then basically we just grab all the stuff starting pretty much at the end of the comment. All right. So let's take a look at what that does. So notice I'm getting the star and paren there, so I am actually kind of getting a little bit of extra stuff because, well, what I'm getting back for index of is the index of that character. And really what I want is to go, well, let's see, 1, 2 places beyond that to figure out what we have. So let's take a look there, right? So that's what that gives us. Now, it's hard to see actually what's going on. So there's a little bit more that's going on here that you are going to have to be careful with, and I'll show you this. And let me just kind of fix how this is printing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put double quotes around the line that gets printed so that we can see exactly what characters are left on each line. Okay. So notice the first three lines, it's perfect. It's beautiful. It totally throws, well, actually the third line, again, right? So the third line is totally empty. We didn't have any issues there. Lines 1 and 2, it just condenses down to the empty string. Absolutely perfect. Exactly what we want. But then we get here on these number ones and we realize, oh yeah, you know what? We actually have a little bit of extra space there. So again, you're going to have to be a little bit careful about that. Now, I'm not going to solve that in the video and all that. I just wanted to kind of show you some of these tips. Okay. All right. So hopefully that begins to give you an idea of how you can deal with some of this. Actually, you know what? I'll show you just kind of one other brief thing. So for instance, I could have something like this. Then I could say if line. I could do starts with. Let me show you one of the other things that you're probably eventually going to need, and that's this. Okay, so char at 0 is equal to the space character. Okay. Now, one hint here, I'm going to tell you. At some point, eventually, once you whittle all these down to the individual things, you're going to ultimately need something like this for counting out, what the first digit is and so forth. Okay. So, but the thing is, remember, these, when you use char at, are characters. So ultimately, if I'm using this technique, I'm going to have things like, for instance, this, right? So let's see. Right, and I could even do a while in case there ended up to being multiple spaces in front. Okay, so we would have something like that. So if this is the case, notice I'm putting it in single quotes. Why? Because char at is going to return a character, right? If I do this, it's never going to work. Right? It's never going to work because what this asks is the ASCII code for that first character equal to 1, right? And no, the ASCII code, even if it was the digit 1, will not be equal to 1, okay? So you really kind of want that. All right, so we would have something like that and so forth, okay? And then you'd do your remove space and all of that. Okay, so hopefully that gives you kind of a general idea of how to begin to how to approach this, how you can kind of pick these things apart, and so forth. Let me just show you some other things as well, right? So there's this. There is a class called String Builder. Notice it's a mutable sequence of characters, right? So unlike strings that once they're created, you can't actually change them. Except, right, the only real hope you have is to use things like substring to basically get other parts of the string and all that. String Builder allows you to do that, right? So they actually say you can do things like append to a string, insert into a string, and so forth. And you might actually find that there's some other helpful methods as well, right? We do have char at and so forth. Notice there are things like delete. Right, so delete actually removes all of the characters in a removes the characters in that substring of a sequence. Okay, so it actually just throws away all of that stuff. You can delete an individual character at a particular location. You can insert characters and so forth. Okay, now the only question is, well, how do you actually use these things given a string? That's easy. It's right here. Right? So you can simply take a string and create a variable that is a string builder, pass that into to the constructor, and now you have a string builder object, and then you're able to call these other methods and so forth. Okay, so again, that's another way of kind of approaching some of this stuff and working at it. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. Helps you kind of get working on that. And again, if you have questions, post them up on Piazza.